Good day. Today is Friday, 2nd January 2026, and this is, of course, my first video for the new year for 2026. May I take again the opportunity to wish you all a very happy new year. In addition, if once you've watched this program, you've decided that you like what you've heard, please do remember to tick the like button, and whilst you're about it, please also check maybe your subscription to this channel. Now, with that, let me get on with the program today. And there's a lot going on in the world. There's much discussion about protests in Iran, for example, and there's also some rather strange activities involving tankers, which I will come to later in this program. But let me first of all begin with the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And the last couple of days, the days around the New Year holiday, have, I think, been interesting and perhaps important because they are the moment when the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, has decisively stepped out of the shadows and has effectively claimed ownership of the project that is being conducted by the United States and by the Western powers in Ukraine. And we've had further confirmation of this over the last few hours. Just a few hours before I started making this program, we learnt that President Zelensky of Ukraine has now acted to replace his former chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, who was ousted from his position a few weeks ago in connection with the ongoing corruption scandal in Kiev. And the man who Zelensky has chosen, who he has picked to take Yermak's place, turns out to be none other than Kirill Budanov, the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence. I presume he's going to give up that post, though it is highly likely that the person who will take charge of Ukrainian military intelligence will be one of Budanov's protégés, and that Budanov will retain control of that important intelligence agency. But before discussing Budanov and the immediate political implications of his appointment, well, let me say again what is universally known throughout Ukraine, what has been all but admitted in the US media as well, I believe the New York Times specifically, some months ago, which is that Budanov has had throughout his career, first as a special forces soldier and a covert operator in Ukraine, and then as chief of Ukrainian military intelligence, that Budanov has had a very, very close relationship with the US intelligence community, in other words, with the CIA. And I am not, I think, understating things or overstating things when I say that many commentators in Ukraine, the blogger, for example, who writes the extraordinarily interesting Substack blog, Events in Ukraine, has referred to Budanov as a CIA asset. He's just one example. Many people in Ukraine, many people who write and comment about the conflict in Ukraine, they've noticed how close Budanov's relationship to the CIA it has been, and they've assumed, perhaps rightly, that he is in fact an outright CIA asset. So Budanov is now chief of staff, Zelensky's chief of staff, and he is in effect now the second most powerful man in Ukraine, or at least he occupies a position which Zelensky's previous chief of staff Andrei Yermak made the second most powerful position in Ukraine. And bearing in mind that Budanov, as I said, will continue to control his intelligence, his former intelligence agency, Ukrainian military intelligence, that basically highlights what a very powerful figure he's going to be. There is much rumor, by the way, many claims, and indeed I have no doubt about this, that Budanov also has very close links with many of the people involved in the various nationalist brigades that form such an important part of the Ukrainian armed forces. And he is apparently lionized. He's considered a hero amongst many of the people who serve in these nationalist brigades as well. So, Budanov is now assuming an extremely important role, a role in which potentially he could overshadow Zelensky himself. Somebody who is widely seen as an American intelligence asset, someone who has contacts with the nationalist brigades, someone who has contacts inside the Ukrainian military, somebody who has effective control of one of Ukraine's most powerful intelligence agencies, is now right at the center of the political scene. He occupies the number 2 slot. It's perhaps premature to say that Zelensky is out of the picture, but it does start to look to me as if Zelensky is indeed now being sidelined. That perhaps the latest meetings, the most recent meetings between Zelensky and the Americans, the meeting in Miami, for example, might have been the moment when both in Washington and in Kiev, the decision was finally made that Zelensky is impossible, that he is uncooperative and probably corrupt, and that Washington's man must now take the reins in Kiev. I think that is highly likely. It's, as I said, perhaps unwise to count Zelensky entirely out. No doubt he will continue to have his allies within the political system. But the fact that he's accepted Budanov as his number 2 is a very interesting thing. Now, I say that, it's perhaps worth pointing out that just 2 or 3 weeks ago, it seemed as if Budanov might be in some disfavor when a Ukrainian delegation, which included Budanov, was sent to Miami about 3 weeks ago, to meet with the Americans. It was striking that the Ukrainians, when they met in a restricted format with Rubio, Witkoff, and Kushner, eased Budanov himself out of the meeting. But anyway, now Budanov is there. And that the Americans have strong links with Budanov is perhaps further confirmed, independently of what the American media reports have been telling us, by a meeting that took place, again some weeks ago, between the US Undersecretary for the Army, Dan Driscoll, who seemed at one point to be making a pitch to take over General Kellogg's job as the key US negotiator, peace negotiator, bringing an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Anyway, Driscoll gate-crashed a meeting in Abu Dhabi between Budanov and Russian officials about exchanges of prisoners and such things. The Russians did not expect Driscoll to be in the meeting, and there was some annoyance about it, as I remember, from Moscow. This was not supposed to be a meeting that was to be made public in that way, but it seems that Driscoll learnt about this meeting from Budanov, at least that was my assumption, and I've never seen any evidence to refute it. And it was basically at Budanov's invitation that Driscoll established direct contacts with the Russians. So anyway, there we are. Budanov now moves center stage. And I am going to anticipate much of the rest of my program by saying what I think ultimately this is all about. Now, Budanov has spoken extensively about negotiations over the course of this year. He's spoken about the importance of securing a ceasefire. He's spoken about the fact that without a ceasefire, Ukraine is doomed militarily. He said this at the start of the year. He said that unless there was a ceasefire by midsummer, the situation on the front lines would start to visibly deteriorate. And that has turned out to be right, by the way. And Budanov has said similar things, and he said things very like this recently in a further interview that he did. He has become an advocate of a ceasefire with the Russians, though not so far of major political concessions or indeed territorial concessions to the Russians. So one view of Budanov's appointment is that he has been brought in order to negotiate with the Russians to achieve a compromise, the compromise that Zelensky has consistently rejected, to try to get that ceasefire, or at least that end of the fighting. It might involve, for example, a retreat from Donbass or something of that kind. But anyway, its primary purpose, its overriding intention, is to get the Russians to stop. And I think that there is probably something in that. But I think there is something else as well, and I think this is perhaps better explains, in light of the information we are now getting from the United States and the US media about the CIA's role in the war. Anyway, I think there is something else, and it is much bigger, and it is much more important, which is that Budanov, over the last few months, has basically been saying that there is no prospect of Ukraine achieving any kind of military victory in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, that it cannot defeat the Russian army. And as I have pointed out, I think I pointed this out many months ago now, but there was an article, I believe it was last year, and I believe it was in the New York Times, which spoke about how in the spring of 2024, a meeting of Ukrainian and Western intelligence officials took place in Washington. And the Ukrainians briefed the Western intelligence officials there, and briefed the Americans that the trajectory of the war pointed to a Russian victory if the war remained conventional. And the decision that was taken then, and it's important to say this was whilst the Biden administration was still in place, the decision that was taken then was to seek asymmetrical approaches to the war, to look for ways to achieve victory without taking on in conventional battle, the Russian army. And the result was, in effect, a major cranking up of covert operations. Now, I do not know that Budanov himself was present at this meeting in Washington, but I think it is highly likely that he was. And I think this gives us the clue to what lies behind, what ultimately lies behind his appointment. The Americans, the intelligence community in Washington, the CIA, probably can see that the war, in effect, is being lost. They are aware, of course, of all of the many reports that we've been hearing about Pokrovsk and other places, Gulyapolye, Zaporozhye, all of these various Russian advances that I've discussed in such painstaking detail in earlier programs, and which are discussed in even more painstaking detail, but by other people in other programs and in various articles. So the CIA presumably does know about this, and it does probably have a fair amount of knowledge about the real condition of the Ukrainian armed forces. So they understand that in conventional terms the war is lost. But they want to pursue an asymmetric conflict against the Russians. They want to do it through sabotage, through all of the various cloak and dagger operations we've seen being used to mounting effect over the last year and a half. The assassinations, the bombings, the attacks on Russian strategic bases, all of those things. And who better to turn to than Kirill Budanov, regarded as a hero by many people in Ukraine, somebody supported by the brigades, the nationalist brigades, and somebody who, it's important to stress, first and foremost is a special forces officer, somebody who has himself built up his career through covert operations. I made this point many times about Budanov. He has never really impressed me as an actual intelligence chief. In fact, after the conflict began, after the Russians began the SMO, for the first 2 years, Budanov gave fantastically inaccurate and over-optimistic from a Ukrainian point of view, assessments of the state of the war and of the state of the Russian military. He only began to change his rhetoric towards the end of 2024 and publicly and decisively over the course of 2025. He's never been someone, in my opinion, who actually has much in the way of reliable intelligence data from inside Russia. Some people in the West may think otherwise, but whenever Budanov has talked about the situation inside Russia, he has consistently turned out to be wrong. Where Budanov excels and has excelled both during this conflict and in his career before is in covert operations. And I think that Budanov has now been brought into the center of the Ukrainian power system because as the war begins to wind down, as Ukraine approaches defeat, he is the obvious person to conduct an insurgency war against the Russians. An insurgency war, if the Russians control much of Ukraine, an insurgency not just, by the way, in former Ukrainian territory, which the Russians control, but maybe even in pre-2014 Russia itself. And of course, if Ukraine fails completely, if the front lines break down, if the Russian army advances and captures more and more territory, if it seizes Odessa and Nikolaev, if it seizes Kharkiv and Poltava and Chernigov and Sumy, if it takes Kiev itself, well, who better to organize a guerrilla army, if you like, a partisan struggle against the Russians than the man who has been involved in covert operations in one form or another consistently for the last 10 years in harness with the CIA. And that man, of course, is Budanov himself. Now, I remember back in 2024 when there was question marks about who would take over as Ukraine's defense chief, when the defense chief of that time, Reznikov, was forced to resign. There was talk then that Budanov might take over as defense chief. There was also talk that he might replace Zelensky as overall military commander, even though Budanov has no command training, at least in conventional war. But I remember it being pointed out to me privately then that if the plan is to start an insurgency war after the Russians win, then putting Budanov in senior positions, those kind of senior positions, would position him exactly in the place you would want him to be, so that he could start preparations for that insurgency war. Well, that didn't happen in 2024, but it has now happened. It has now happened at a point where it looks as if the Russians will shortly take full control of Donbass, and where the Russians are approaching the Dnieper and the city of Zaporozhye. And that now brings me directly to the CIA, who have been Budanov's chief allies and sponsors, and according to rumour, perhaps his controllers, if he really is an asset, which, by the way, I don't know, let me stress. Anyway, the CIA, we have now been told through a multiplicity of reports in the New York Times, has in effect been conducting the entire drone war that the Ukrainians have been conducting against Russia. It is the CIA that has been providing the Ukrainians with the targeting information, telling them which refineries they should attack, refineries that are selected because apparently the equipment in these refineries, as the CIA believes, is Western sourced and therefore difficult for the Russians to replace. It is the CIA that has been helping the Ukrainians conduct drone attacks against tankers that ferry oil from Russian ports, tankers in the Black Sea, tankers in the Mediterranean off the coast of Libya, tankers off the coast of West Africa as well. It is the United States that provides all the information and all of the targeting data about this. And we're told by the New York Times that at some point midsummer, even as President Trump was again talking about starting negotiations with the Russians, sending Witkoff to the Kremlin to meet with Putin and making all kinds of proposals. We'll come to those in a moment. Even as all of that was going on, the CIA's director, Mr. Radcliffe, was meeting with Trump, urging him to give the CIA the green light to conduct these drone attacks inside Russia, to attack the Russian energy complex, the oil and gas and refineries complex. And Trump delightedly agreed. He thought that this would be a wonderful way of putting pressure on the Russians, even as he was proposing to negotiate with them, and one which could happen even as Trump himself could claim plausible deniability. Again, an extraordinary example, if I may say so, if that account is true, of Trump's naivety and, by the way, also of his duplicity. Naivety because Trump assumed that the Russians would never know, presumably, and Trump perhaps also assumed that the fact would never be disclosed publicly in the way that it has just been, and duplicity because, of course, he was telling the Russians that he was opposed to strikes deep inside Russia. That was what he said during last year, in 2024's presidential election. He stopped the attack and strikes on Russia and all that. But of course, he was providing the green light to the CIA to conduct drone strikes inside Russia, even as he was seeking to negotiate simultaneously with the Russians. I will come to all of that later. Now, so the CIA has been operating the drone campaign, but it goes beyond this, because back in March of last year, Trump briefly, for about a week, announced that he was ending intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians. And many people at the time, myself included, by the way, assumed that this was indeed the case, that the United States was no longer sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. It turns out that the Pentagon mostly, though very grudgingly, went along with Trump's order, but the CIA did not. They continued to share intelligence with Ukraine, and again, Radcliffe came along and told Trump that that would be the best course and that it would strengthen Trump's hand in negotiations with the Russians. Supposedly, the intelligence that the CIA was sharing with the Ukrainians was restricted to the situation on the actual front lines within pre-2014 Ukrainian territory. But I'm going to say straight away that I personally don't believe that. It looks to me as if the entire story about the United States switching off intelligence to the Ukrainians was mostly or largely untrue, or at the very least much exaggerated. Anyway, so the CIA was involved in all of that. And we've had another example over the last couple of days, apparently, of the CIA again intervening to try to keep Trump focused on intensifying or supporting the CIA's drone war against Russia. A couple of days ago, as I've discussed in recent programs, the Russians complained that the Ukrainians had launched 91 drones with the aim of attacking the Russian presidential residence in Novgorod, near Lake Valdai. It's unclear whether Putin himself was there. The Russians were furious about this attack and publicly complained about it. The media, the Ukrainians, published flat denials. The media in Europe, at least, much of the West, in fact, spun stories casting doubt about whether there'd been any sort of Ukrainian drone attack on Novgorod region at all. The Russians were pressed to provide evidence for their claims. I read and heard commentaries about the fact that the Russians hadn't produced a single drone, and Peskov was ridiculed when he said that this was a matter for the Russian military to provide that evidence. But when he pointed out that demanding that the Russians produce the drones was to demand rather a lot, given that all the drones had been shot down. Anyway, there was a lot of ridicule and mockery of these Russian comments. And then, of course, we read in the New York Times that Radcliffe has come along and admitted to Trump that there was a Ukrainian drone attack on Novgorod after all. The Ukrainians did indeed launch drones at Novgorod, but they weren't targeting Putin's residence. They weren't targeting Valdai, the residence at Valdai. They were targeting some other military target that we are not told what that target was. For the record, by the way, I have noticed that the British media is not reporting these admissions in the New York Times, at least not as of the time when I'm making this program. I get the sense that there are a lot of red faces in London. The media having previously given the impression that the entire Russian claim about a Ukrainian drone attack on Novgorod was a fiction, only for the CIA to tell Trump and for the American media to confirm that there was a Ukrainian drone attack on Novgorod after all. But Radcliffe, nonetheless, as I said, assured Trump that it was not Valdai, not Putin's own residence, that was the target, and that the Russians are lying about this. Now, the Russians, who have been goaded to provide evidence for their claims, are now increasingly doing so. They provided tracking information showing the directions of the various drones. They provided footage of one of the drones, that this has been, as I said, unwisely ridiculed in the British media, though it turns out it was a drone, just as the Russians said. And the Russians now say that they've been able to decrypt or decode one of the programming things on one of the drones, and that this confirms that Putin's Valdai residence was indeed the target. And the Russians have now provided all of this data to the Americans. There's pictures of Russian officers giving all of this data to the American military representative, the American arms defense attaché at the US Embassy in Moscow. I previously, in previous videos, said that these demands for the Russians to provide proof of their accusation that the Ukrainians had conducted a drone strike at Putin's residence were completely in bad faith. Because even if the Russians provided every scintilla of evidence that was asked of them, as night follows day, the Western media would either ignore the evidence, which is exactly what they're doing at the moment, or ridicule it. They would never accept this information as true. Anyway, I still believe that the Russians have provided this information to the Americans. I doubt it will ever get to Trump, just to say. It will probably all disappear somewhere within the US military, within the vast US bureaucracy, just saying. But anyway, the point is, the key thing is that the CIA has been involved in Ukraine's drone offensive, certainly the drone offensive this year, probably the drone attacks that Ukraine has conducted in previous years, and the CIA has acted to protect not just Ukraine, but Ukraine's drone offensive from criticism after the Russians alleged that some of these drones targeted Putin's residence at Valdai with this apparently causing Trump to tell Putin over the phone that he was shocked and very angry. So the CIA continues to protect Ukraine. It continues to support the drone offensive. This is my major take of this story. And I noticed, by the way, that the Russians have been complaining over the last 24 hours that there was a Ukrainian drone strike on a hotel building in Kherson region, Russian control Kherson region. According to the Russians, 27 people, civilians, were killed in that strike. There's been scant reporting of this in the Western media. I saw one article in The Guardian, but mostly the Western media are ignoring this story. For the record, there is a report in the British media today about a Russian drone attack which apparently is endangering animals in a Ukrainian zoo, which is a serious thing, no doubt. But the media outlet that's reporting that story has absolutely nothing to say about 27 killed civilians killed as a result of a Ukrainian drone strike in Kherson region. A Ukrainian drone strike, it doesn't seem as if that strike is being denied. So all of the indications are that the CIA has every intention of continuing these drone operations. The CIA director is committed to them. In fact, the media is saying, the US media, the New York Times is saying that though one of the first steps that the new Trump-appointed team did when they took over in the Pentagon was to remove the various generals who had been most supportive of continuing the conflict in Ukraine. Radcliffe, when appointed to take charge of the CIA, did the opposite. He made sure that all of the people within the CIA, both in Langley and in Ukraine itself, the various CIA operatives in Ukraine, remained in place and continued to receive the same level of support for what they were doing. Now, the New York Times claims that there is a split within the administration, that there is one group which can be basically summed up as the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the civilian officials in the Pentagon, people like Elbridge Colby and to some extent Pete Hegseth, who are becoming increasingly skeptical of the conflict in Ukraine. They see it as a losing proposition. They think that the United States is massively over-invested in it. They want to focus on China and Asia and on the defense of the Western Hemisphere. And they would want to come, if it were possible, to some kind of long-term understanding with the Russians, which would require some kind of ending of the conflict with Russia, the proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. Against this group, there is the other group, which is the CIA and others who remain committed to the conflict in Ukraine, with the CIA being absolutely committed to supporting the various covert operations of the drone war that Ukraine is undertaking. And according to the New York Times, the president himself dithers. Sometimes he goes with Vance, the Pentagon people, Colby, for example, who want to wind the war down and come to an agreement with the Russians. At other times, he follows the lead of Radcliffe and the CIA and of the hardliners within the US intelligence community. And there is supposedly a division and even an unraveling. I am going to take a rather more cynical view. My own view, straightforwardly, is this, and I go back to what I said at the beginning of the program. More and more people in Washington can see that the Ukraine war, fought in a conventional way, is lost. Ukraine was unable to conduct any offensives of its own in 2025. It had successfully conducted offensives in 2022. It unsuccessfully conducted an offensive in 2023. In fact, that offensive in Zaporozhye region ended in disaster. It unsuccessfully conducted a counteroffensive in Kursk region in Russia in 2024. That offensive, by the way, also ended in disaster. In 2025, Ukraine has been on the back foot constantly and all the time, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to pretend or to deny that Ukraine is going to lose the war. Going back to what I was saying earlier in the program, what it seems to me is happening is that the consensus in Washington is that the conventional part of the war is lost. Let us go back instead to a plan first floated, as I remember, in January 2022. I commented about it then when the first reports appeared. The Americans apparently warned the Russians back in January 2022 that they would do it. If the Russians win in Ukraine, if they are successful, if they're able to establish or achieve their objectives in Ukraine, well, you don't give up, you continue the war, but you do so through covert means. You conduct sabotage operations, assassinations, drone strikes, all of these things, and you continue to weaken Russia, pull it down, cause ultimately destabilization and an internal crisis. But you don't give up with your overall objective, which is to defeat Russia in some form in Ukraine. It's the means that change, not the objective. And yes, probably people like Vance and people like Colby are not supporters of this, but I don't think that they are probably in a position to oppose it, because I think that this is the overall consensus that exists in Washington now. So that brings us back full circle to Budanov's appointment. We see that that is what is being prepared from this point on. 2026 is going to be the year, I suspect, when Zelensky's star finally fades and when Budanov's star brightens. And if there is no peace, no end of the conflict in Ukraine, which I have to say I think is far and away the most likely outcome, if the Russians win on the battlefields, which I also think is an almost inevitable outcome if there is no peace, well then, as I said, all of the arrangements have now been made to continue the war by other means. Now, let me say a few things here about the long-term prospects of that. As people who have watched my programs will know, I am a massive skeptic about special operations. I have read extensively the history of what these special operations conducted by the British during the Second, and the Americans during the Second World War against the Germans actually achieved. And in summary, the answer is not very much. A lot of people were killed to no significant purpose. I doubt that all these special operations, despite the various films that celebrate them, advanced the end of the war. or the victory against the Germans by so much as a single day. And I predict the same will be true of this insurgency war that is now being planned against the Russians. It will not defeat the Russians. The attack on the refineries has not created an energy crisis, a gasoline crisis in Russia, as many claimed. It has not dented Russian exports of crude oil. Mostly what the Russians export is indeed crude oil. That hasn't happened either. There is no sign that it has had any significant effect on the growth rates or the general macroeconomic picture in Russia itself. The CIA is claiming, apparently, that the cost of all of these attacks on the refineries and the tankers to the Russians has been in the order of $75 million a day. For an economy the size of Russia's, that is basically loose change. But I doubt personally that it has been anywhere near as much. And the CIA may believe that some of these refineries that have been attacked use technologies and equipment that the Russians would have difficulty replacing because of the sanctions. That might have been true at the beginning, but by now the Russians will have succeeded in developing their own replacements. We're not talking about very high-end technology equipment here. So this is not going to destabilize Russia. It is not going to bleed Russia dry or create a political crisis in Kiev. If the Russians find themselves facing an insurgency in Ukraine, I am confident that they will be able to overcome it. The Russians, perhaps more than any other country, have particular skills and experience in how to overcome insurgencies. And for the record, I've written a piece on our Substack blog that looks at this whole question, and I've set out my views on it, about this topic there. And anybody who wishes to see my discussion can find it on my Substack blog and read it there all in detail. So this isn't going to work. What it will do is poison relations between Russia and the United States. It will undermine the arguments of those in Russia who still want to achieve some kind of understanding, long-term understanding with the Americans, Putin probably being one such person. It will inflict more misery on the people of Ukraine. And of course, the thing about dirty wars of this kind, as by the way I warned way back in January 2022 in a video on this channel, which I did then before the war itself began, what it will do if this ever happens is that it will spread. The dirty war will inevitably, unavoidably spread to Europe itself, because it will be in Europe, it will be from European territory that this dirty war will be conducted. So there it is. That's, I'm afraid, the dismal prospect that we face. I regard Budanov's appointment as ominous news. And I regard this chain of articles, this succession of articles that have appeared in the US media, as not being coincidental in terms of Budanov's appointment. They point in the direction that things will now take. We will probably see many more efforts over the next few weeks and months to try to come to some kind of negotiation and find some kind of solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Budanov himself has spoken in favor of these things. But overall, underlying it all, underpinning it all, there remains this objective, as I said, to begin an insurgency, a long-term insurgency war against the Russians, which will spread ultimately to Europe and to all sorts of other places. And speaking of other places, we can already see this playing out in the tanker wars. So the United States has been busy seizing tankers, as we know, in the Caribbean mainly. They've tried to seize a particular tanker, the Bella II, which was carrying Venezuelan crude oil, or perhaps it was Iranian oil. I mean, there's all kinds of contradictory stories. There's claims that this tanker was Iranian-owned, who knows what. Anyway, the crew of this tanker, which has so far managed to avoid seizure by the US Navy, has now painted the Russian flag onto its hull. The ship has changed its name and has been included in the Russian maritime register as a Russian ship. Apparently 40% now of so-called shadow fleet tankers are now raising the Russian flag. This has apparently caused legal confusion and uncertainty within the United States, and they haven't yet figured out a way how to seize this particular tanker. But we can see that the Russians are now starting to take action to protect tankers. They're telling threatened tankers, to raise the Russian flag. Russia, of course, has a powerful fleet, and it is capable of seizing Western merchant ships, in retaliation to any of its ships, which are also seized. Now, something which has gone almost completely unreported in the media in the West is that another big player in this area has now entered the game, and that is China. I have pointed out that some of the tankers that the United States seized that were ferrying oil from Venezuela were probably ultimately Chinese owned and were carrying oil paid for by China or Chinese businesses, and which is therefore the property of Chinese property. Well, the Chinese also have shown that they are in the game of seizing ships. They've just seized a merchant ship that was traveling to Taiwan. They claim that they found in its cargo weapons that were to be provided to Taiwan, HIMARS missiles, I believe. Anyway, this has been extensively reported in the Chinese media and in Chinese social media. I am not absolutely sure about the ownership of this particular merchant ship, but I cannot help but think that the Chinese, by seizing this ship at this time when ships are being seized all over the place, are giving their first warnings. So, dirty wars have an ability to spiral out of control. And I'm very much afraid that that is precisely what we're going to see happen. Now, I will end all of this by returning again to the attack on Kherson and to the attack on Novgorod. We now know that the United States, the CIA, has been heavily involved in the drone war against Russia. What did they know in advance about these two attacks? I think it is a legitimate question, one which, of course, nobody is asking. I am asking it, perhaps they can tell us. When CIA Director Radcliffe comes along and tells Trump that the drones that were heading to Novgorod were not targeting Putin's residence, does he say that with particular authority because the CIA was involved in launching those drones? Again, I ask these questions. Perhaps we should be provided with an answer. I doubt that the questions will be made, and I doubt that the answers will ever be given. In the meantime, as night follows day, there is going to be a very strong Russian reaction. The Russians are still furious about the attack on Novgorod, and they are also furious about the attack on Kherson region. Russian officials have been vocal in their criticism, and they're pointing to the complete silence from European, indeed Western governments about the attack on the hotel in Kherson region specifically. Over the next couple of days, I don't think it will be too delayed. There will be a big Russian response. I'm not going to try and anticipate what it will be, but the fact that the Russians have been publishing so many pictures of the Oreshnik may indeed point to the Oreshnik itself being used. In the meantime, the Russians continue their advance. I'm going to give only a relatively brief summary of the military situation today, but briefly, Stepnogorsk, definitely now under Russian control. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that. And the Russians do seem to be pushing, or perhaps creeping slowly towards Zaporozhye city from the south. But perhaps more importantly, the Russians, now that they've captured Gulyapolye, are pushing towards Orekhov and ultimately Zaporozhye from the east, and the Russian forces who just captured Stepnogorsk, a paratroop division by the way, are also pushing eastwards towards Orekhov. So Orekhov likely to be surrounded fairly soon, and there are reports that there is already street fighting going on in Orekhov itself. If Orekhov is captured by the Russians at some point within the next couple of weeks, then we will definitely be looking at the start of the battle for the city of Zaporozhye itself. But maybe we shouldn't anticipate events before they happen. There are also lots of reports that the Russians are now pushing north from Pakrovsk, that they are in the process of recapturing positions that they briefly captured during their August breakthrough in northeast of Pakrovsk in the Dobropilye area. There are suggestions that the Russians are targeting the town of Dobropilye itself for capture. And I might have been wrong a couple of videos ago in saying that I wasn't sure that Russian claims about the situation in Konstantinovka, the big town to the east of Pakrovsk where the Russians are fighting, that the Russian claims of major advances there, I thought those might have been exaggerated, but the Ukrainians themselves, Ukrainian soldiers who are there, are talking about an increasingly bad situation for the Ukrainian army in Konstantinovka, that the supply lines are starting to be cut, that the Russians are pushing hard in Konstantinovka, and that the situation in Konstantinovka is becoming critical. And of course, further to the north, fighting continues. The Russians continue to push westwards from Siversk. And, well, I've noticed that the Ukrainians are still claiming that they're conducting counterattacks in Kupiansk, but they're also now saying that the Russians are bringing more and more troops into Kupiansk, and that the Russian Air Force is very active in the Kupiansk area, which may suggest, or suggests to me, that the fighting around Kupiansk is probably going to develop before very long into a Russian offensive from Kupiansk westwards. Anyway, we will see. There's still heavy fog of war about this. I would add that the weather conditions in Ukraine are now particularly difficult. There's been heavy snowfalls and, again, heavy mist. It's not always easy to work out exactly what is going on, and the snow probably is impeding Russian advances to some extent. Gerasimov, the overall Russian commander, who's also chief of the general staff, in the meantime, has recently visited the headquarters of Group of Forces North, who are active in Kharkiv and Sumy region. The Russian forces in the north seem to be particularly busy in Sumy region, and it may be that some kind of a push towards the city of Sumy is itself now going to materialize. According to the Russian commander of Group of Forces North, General Nikiforov, his advanced units are just 20 kilometers away from the city of Sumy itself. Anyway, that's a quick overview of the situation on the front lines. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians continue drone attacks against each other. There was a particularly heavy drone attack by the Ukrainians on Moscow over the course of New Year's Day. There's some reports that it caused blackouts in the city. That may be true. I have not myself seen corroboration of this, but I'm not saying that's wrong. But there was a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal which confirmed that the massive strikes that the Russians have been conducting against Odessa and the neighboring region, which have caused almost semi-permanent blackouts in Odessa, have brought the operation of the port of Odessa, which is Ukraine's major remaining port. In fact, as far as I can tell, its only significant operating port, that it has brought Odessa, the port of Odessa, the operation of the port of Odessa, essentially to a stop. The Wall Street Journal speaks about a semi-blockade by the Russians of Odessa. I have said in many programs that it seemed to me that the Russians, if they wanted to blockade Odessa, could do so. It looks as if they now are intending to do it. And, well, the Wall Street Journal admits that the inability to export food and other products is inevitably going to have a further major economic impact on the Ukrainian economy. So anyway, that's, as I said, the situation on the front lines. Negotiations will no doubt continue in some form. Putin has been too much involved in negotiations up to now, I think, to discontinue these entirely. And of course, Trump has a vested interest in continuing negotiations. But as always, the frontline events will continue to dictate the course of the conflict. And as I've said, some people in Washington and in Kiev probably understand that in terms of the conventional conflict, the writing is on the wall, and they're looking beyond it to continue the conflict in other ways. In the meantime, in Europe, we remain paralyzed in inaction. There was a brilliant article from the Ron Paul Institute talking about Europe's complete inability to construct an effective war-fighting system, economic system. Europe's panic economy, frozen assets, empty arsenals, and the quiet admission of defeat. Europe can posture for war. It cannot produce for war. 4 years into a high-intensity war of attrition, the United States and Europe are confronting a truth they spent decades unlearning. You do not sustain this kind of conflict with theatrical speeches, sanctions, or abandoning diplomacy. You supply it with shells, missiles, train crews, repair cycles, and production rates that exceed losses month after month without interruption. By 2025, the gap is no longer theoretical. Russia is now producing artillery ammunition at a scale that Western officials themselves concede outpaces the combined output of NATO. Russian industry has shifted to continuous near wartime production without being fully mobilized, with centralized procurement, simplified supply chains, and state-directed throughput. Estimates place annual Russian artillery production at several million rounds. Production already flowing, not promised. Europe, by contrast, has spent 2025 celebrating targets it cannot ever materially meet. And this is absolutely true, and it's worth reading the entire article to see this. Incidentally, can I again push back on the common Western trope that Russia is running a war economy or a mobilization economy? The consensus is that Russia currently is devoting around 6% of its GDP to defense issues, military and defense related issues, including conducting the special military operation. That falls well short of a war economy. In 1968, during the war in Vietnam, the United States devoted around 10% of its GDP to defense-related matters. In the early 1950s, Britain committed around 14% of its GDP to defense-related matters. Neither the United States in 1968 nor Britain in the early 50s were referred to as war economies. Just saying. If you want to see what an actual war economy looks like, then look at the United States in 1944, where war-related production accounted for 40% of GDP. In Germany, in that same year, war-related economic output related to around 75% of GDP. Those were war economies. An economy where the burden of the military amounts to just 6% of GDP is an economy where perhaps war-related matters account for a significant and unusually high proportion of economic output, but it falls well short of a war economy. Which means, incidentally, that if the Russians need to expand military production further, they have ample space to do it. Whereas, as we see in Europe, as this article in the Ron Paul Institute essentially says, in Europe, we haven't even been able to get past first base. Anyway, that is a big subject to be discussed much more extensively in other places. Let me, in the meantime, at this point, having finished my discussion about Ukraine today, now turn briefly to the situation in Iran. Iran has experienced a very unstable economic situation for just about as long as I can remember. The situation has been aggravated over the course of 2025 by a severe water shortage, which has affected Tehran. The currency has lost in recent months around 40% of its value. This has led to very high inflation, and this has caused protests by many people in Iran, particularly people within the business community, small shop owners, people in the bazaar, people of that kind. All of this is probably in part the effect of sanctions. In fact, I've no doubt it is, to a great extent, the effect of sanctions. Probably even more, it is the consequence of the very high, very steep fall in oil prices that we have seen over the course of 2025. Oil, of course, being Iran's major export, and Iran has been able to continue to export oil, even if, like Russia, it's had to work to set up workarounds in order to do it. But these two things, the oil price fall, the water crisis, all of these are the proximate cause for Iran's economic problems. I suspect that there is a further factor, and I'm going to say it, and it'll probably make me unpopular with some people, but I suspect that there is a great deal of economic mismanagement, and I suspect it has got worse since the election of President Pezeshkian. Now, to say it briefly, as a human being, I believe President Pezeshkian is a very decent person. I also think that he is massively out of his depth, leading Iran. I felt that during the 12-day war. He seems to still hanker for some kind of rapprochement or coming to terms with the West. And it has been a consistent story in Iran that whenever people who might be described as being on the more liberal end of the Iranian political spectrum take charge of the economy and try to carry out the kind of reforms that liberal economists in the West suggest, it never turns out very well for Iran. Now, there are many reasons for this, but the main one is, firstly, that I don't think these reforms are really, or these approaches are very well adapted to Iran's current economic needs. And beyond that, I also get the sense that many of the people who run the economy in Iran, who have these ideas and backgrounds, do not have the skills or the abilities to run an economy like the Iranian economy very well. So I think we have seen a conjunction of these problems come together in Iran over the last few months. Now, I might be wrong in some of my analysis. I'm not going to pretend I know Iran especially well. But what I will say about these protests is this. So far, they have been, by Iranian standards, relatively small, and they appear to be confined to specific sections of Iranian society, the business community, the shopkeepers, people of that kind. So far, the larger population, the people in the villages, the people in the working class areas of Tehran, don't seem to be joining the protests. I suspect that President Trump's warnings that he has made over the last couple of hours that the United States will react very strongly if the Iranian authorities take action against the protesters. I suspect that's going to weaken the protests and it is going to rally support to the Iranian government. And going on to Iranian government websites, I can see that that is exactly the message that the Iranian authorities are busy circulating, that the protesters who continue to protest, even if many of them are patriotic people with genuine grievances, they're being manipulated by Trump and by the United States and by the West and by Israel and by all of Iran's various enemies, and that in this kind of situation, the government will indeed do what it can to address protests, the causes of the protests. They've appointed a new central bank chief, for example, but that protests at this time are unhelpful and they will destabilize the situation in Iran. I doubt that these protests by themselves will undermine or threaten the existing political system in Iran. It has become very accustomed over the last 20 or so years in absorbing protests. Iran's political system has a degree of fluidity and volatility which makes it difficult for outsiders to understand or to appreciate its underlying stability. I believe that it still has a critical mass of support despite the economic pressures, and I believe that the security agencies of the government are more than sufficient to control the protests if that becomes necessary. So that's all I'm going to say about the protests. The risk with the protests is that they will give a sense in Washington and perhaps in Israel and in other places that the regime, as people call it, is tottering, and that this is the moment to strike again, and that if we strike again, and there's talk of Prime Minister Netanyahu urging President Trump to authorize another strike, that if there is such a strike, the regime will crumble, and that this time that longed for aspiration to change the structures, the political structures in Iran, to bring back the monarchy perhaps, that will finally be achieved. I think that would be a major mistake. I think it would be a huge trap. When the 12-day war was launched in June, the government actually came out of it stronger than it went in. And I think that launching another attack now, especially one purportedly in support of the protests, will not shake the regime, if you want to call it that. It will strengthen it and further legitimize it instead. As for Iran itself, its future, as I have said many times, rests with the BRICS. It needs to deepen economic cooperation with China and Russia. The offers to do it are there. The first steps are being taken. If this is developed properly and pursued consistently, then perhaps for the first time in many decades, economic stability in Iran might be achieved. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and also Substack. Please also remember to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.